in many ways, it's one of the most dramatic and powerful scenes within the whole of the biblical record, isn't it? I don't think you can imagine anything more heart-wrenching than the scene of the mother of the Lord and John as they approach the cross. And it would have been a very difficult moment for the Lord as he looked up and saw through the crowds of the people that were there his beloved disciple John with this handful of women who had afore stood afar off because of shame and embarrassment and because of the crowds that were there, and now they made their way towards the cross. And it's perhaps one of the most hardest things to imagine, the agony and the pain that a mother would have. But of course, this was not just any mother. This was the handmaid, the chosen one of the Lord, and this was her son that was hanging there on the cross. And in around the cross, everywhere there was unbelief. Jesus was surrounded by unbelief. You know, even the disciples, his beloved disciples who forsook him and fled, everyone doubted. And those that were his followers even began to question what the scribes and Pharisees seemed to say made sense. If he's the Son of God, what's he doing up there? It doesn't make any sense. He trusted in God that God would deliver him. He delighted in God, and yet he's hanging on a cross. And the scribes and Pharisees were crying, he's forsaken. God hath forsaken him. And there was unbelief everywhere, except for one person. There was one person who had not a shadow of doubt. Her mind was such that she knew she had carried that child for 9 months, knowing that she had conceived through the power of the Holy Spirit, through unnatural circumstances. She was the one who's recorded in Luke chapter 1 and verse 45 by Elizabeth as being, blessed is she who believed. And perhaps this is in contrast to Sarah, who when God said would have a child, and she was old and past bearing, laughed, and the angel said to Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh? Well, Mary might have been old, and it would have taken an incredible miracle Sarah was old, and it took an incredible miracle for Sarah to conceive and give birth. But in Mary's case, it was unprecedented. Never before in the history had a person given birth through unnatural circumstances, throughout without the normal processes. But she believed when the angel came to her that it was so. She never doubted. And she was chosen specially by God to be, of all the virgins in Israel, she was chosen specially to be the one who would care and help to raise his own son. What an amazing woman she must have been. But how deep was her anguish at this time as John and Mary approached the cross. As they said, they had something in common. They were Jesus' nearest and dearest companions in this world. Again, from a human perspective, there was no one that he had that was closer than the disciple whom he loved and his mother. And so as you see these two approaching the cross, the emotion and the power that is contained in and around that story, it's difficult. It's difficult to visualize what Mary must have been going through. And as Jesus watched and as they approached through these crowds, I can just imagine John with his arm just like this in this picture, having to support Mary. She's lost all her strength. She's overwhelmed with grief. And there are the other women with her, her supporters and her helpers, and her mourners to share with her. Mary Magdalene, who would have just been completely beside herself, emotionally wrung out with grief as they overcame their fear to come to the cross. And they came to the foot of the cross, and it's John's record that records the third saying from the cross in John chapter 19. And I believe the events is such that this probably happened sometime late in the morning, when Jesus was first crucified at 9 a.m. As we said, the woman stood afar off, and the disciples had forsaken him and fled, and nobody was there. But sometime before midday, before the darkness descended upon the land, sometime just before midday, John came with these women down to the foot of the cross. And it says, verse 25, now there, of John chapter 19, now there stood by the foot of the cross, Jesus, stood by the foot of the cross of Jesus, his mother, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple by whom he loved, he said to the woman, behold thy son, and to the disciple whom he loved, behold thy mother. And from that moment, from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. And we know, of course, that the disciple whom the Lord loved is the Apostle John. It's recorded that in John's record, this is the disciple who wrote these things and who testified of these things. And we're going to look at John shortly, but our focus and our attention at the moment is upon Mary. This is Jesus' last will and testament. He wants to give to these two most precious people in his life, his most precious possessions. To his mother, he is going to give to her his beloved disciple, John. And to John, his beloved disciple, he's going to give to him one of the greatest possessions he could ever have in giving to him his mother. And this is an incredible statement of love. And it just shows Jesus' compassion on the cross. Right there, all he's thinking about is them. In the midst of all this suffering and all this anguish, he's thinking about them. You know, of course, as we read in that record in Luke chapter 2, where Simeon first appears in the temple as Mary came to dedicate Jesus. In Luke chapter 2, it says that in verse 34, Simeon came in, of course, and he took the child out of Mary's arms, and he raised up the child, and he said, behold, this child shall be for a light to the Gentiles, the salvation of thy people Israel. And it was almost like, you know, in a prophetic sense, it was like he was crucifying that child right there and then. It was a symbol of what was going to take place. I can imagine Mary and Joseph at this time, they would have been pretty taken by this, you know, like this is just a young boy, and they've gone up to the temple, and this old man, who seems to only be alive by the Spirit of God's come and snatched the child out of her arm, and the drama of it. And then he turned to Mary and he says, in verse 34, Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, behold, the child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, for a sign which will be spoken against, but yea, and a sword shall pierce through thine own soul, that the thoughts of many hearts shall be revealed. Mary, of course, whose name means bitter. She would endure many things. She was specially selected by God to endure sorrow and sadness almost beyond comprehension. From the time she had this child, she was greatly blessed, and the joy of it all that was spoken by Elizabeth, blessed be her of the Lord, that spoke to Mary. But that blessing would soon turn into an enormous burden, wouldn't it? When she got back home from visiting Elizabeth and the scandal erupted. wouldn't have taken long for the shame and the scandal in and around how she came to be with child before she was married, and that she had been down visiting her cousin. And, you know, the Jews picked that up and said to Jesus, "Sayest we not well that thou art a Samaritan?" Implicating that Mary had to pass through Samaria, and that maybe, you know, the father was one of these filthy Samaritans whom they despised and hated, because Jesus seemed to have a love for the Samaritans. So they made this suggestion. And Mary definitely endured a difficult life, and we're first introduced to Mary in this interesting chronology. You know what they say when you do overheads is never put too many words on the screen. There's a good slide for you. That's the whole of the genealogy there in Matthew chapter 1, and we're first introduced to Mary in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 16, where, if you can read that, Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. So that's our first introduction into the record of Mary, and she's in a chronology, which is unusual in itself to find a woman in a chronology. But she's not alone, is she? She's numbered amongst a number in this chronology. There is, of course, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, in amongst a chronology with 4 other women. And these 4 other women all are there in and around their relationship to the genealogy that is the line of the promised seed. They all sit in the line of the promised seed, the one that would come, that would be the seed of the woman to crush the head of the serpent. And all of these women are introduced into the chronology, and they all have something pretty interesting in common. One might say we find them, or we discover them in the record, in suspicious circumstances, don't we? Tamar was a widow who suffered widowhood, and we discover in the record that she dresses up like a harlot. There is an accusation which is made against her, and a threat of her existence, a threat of extinction that is upon her and her line. There is, of course, Rahab, who was a harlot, a past life as a harlot in Jericho. Again, there is the threat of extinction to her and her family and her household when she's introduced into the record. There is Ruth, of course, the Moabitess, who again has the threat of extinction after the loss of her husband. She's a motherless widow, and we find in the record that an incident where she makes some rather dubious overtones by night by going into Boaz's room after the barley harvest. We find Bathsheba again, who is in dubious circumstances in the story of being found with King David to be having committed adultery after the death of her husband. So we find these women who are in the record really as damaged goods. We might say they had baggage. You know, they definitely had a lot of baggage, a lot of issues, didn't they? And yet they're handpicked and chosen. They're very special in the fact that they're going to be the ones that are going to find themselves in the line for the birth of the Messiah. And in contrast, and almost in stark contrast, you're introduced to the story of Mary, of course, who's found as a young virgin, pure young virgin. And the circumstances of her life seems to be directly in contrast. But like all the others who particularly were needing redemption, were needing to be saved by the Goel Redeemer for their line to be continued, Mary is very much the same. There's an incredibly powerful word that is used, that Mary uses in her song of praise in Luke chapter 1 verse 48. She said, "For he has regarded her that is of low estate, his handmaid. For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed." She refers to herself as her that is of low estate. You know, in the Septuagint, the Greek equivalent in the Old Testament, that's the very word that's used for rape. It's a very, very strong word in the Greek. In fact, it's the very word used concerning Jesus and his crucifixion, where it says, "In his humiliation his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation, for his life was taken from the earth." So her situation, whatever it was, she saw as a humiliation. She endured a very difficult life. And Simeon, of course, had said that a sword would pierce thy side also. And she was, of course, to be the one that would give birth to the promised seed, the one that would crush the head of the serpent. And in John's record, by the way, because this saying comes in John's record, so there's three sayings in John's record. There's three sayings in Luke's record. The first two we've looked at, and we'll look at the last one. And there's three sayings in John's record. "Woman, behold thy son behold thy mother. I thirst, and it is finished." They all revolve around the theme of judgment upon the serpent. In fact, the whole of John's Gospel revolves around judgment upon the serpent. "If I be lifted up, the prince of this world shall be cast out." Judgment is the key theme in John's Gospel. And the theme in John's Gospel was the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. So here you've got this picture of Mary who comes to the cross right at that time when Jesus is enacting this whole process of judgment upon the seed of the serpent. And in John's Gospel, it's really interesting that John focuses on a number of women that are in desperate need of redemption to take away their shame. And we find in John chapter 4, there is the woman of Samaria, isn't it? And she was a woman who's directly contrasted to Nicodemus. You know, Nicodemus is the great ruler, the teacher of the law who came to Jesus by night. She's the woman that comes to Jesus in the middle of the day, or meets Jesus at least in the middle of the day. But of course she has some really dubious circumstances in her background. She has 5 husbands, has had 5 husbands, and the man she was with was not her husband, Jesus said in Luke, in John chapter 4. Not quite sure how we would go in terms of fellowshipping this particular woman in our ecclesias. We struggle, wouldn't we? A woman that had 5 husbands and was currently in a de facto relationship, that would be a challenge. We might really say she has a lot of baggage. We find the woman in John chapter 8 who's caught in the very act of adultery. We find Martha, whose brother has died and she is completely in distress over the loss of Lazarus. We find Mary, the sister of Martha, who anoints Jesus in John chapter 12 and wipes his feet with her hair, and Judas comes around and says, why wasn't this ointment sold and given to the poor? What a waste. And Jesus defends Mary. He defends the woman of Samaria. He defends the woman caught in the act of adultery. He defends Martha. He defends the sister of Martha. Then there's Mary, the mother of Jesus, which we're looking at right now, who's enduring the loss of a child. There was also Mary also in John chapter 2. Then there's Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20, who Jesus personally deals with when she is inconsolable with grief. We're going to come back and look at her in this study when we look at John just for a moment. 6 women are highlighted in John's record, but I think there's a 7th one, and we're going to look at it in our last study. John actually paints the picture of the bride as well, both in John chapter 2, but particularly in John chapter 19. And there is a 7th woman that's mentioned in John, or referred to in John, and it's the bride of Christ that has been formed through the side of Jesus. And so you get this quote in Isaiah chapter 4, and in that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own bread and we will wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name, that you might take away our reproach. There are 7 women in John's Gospel whom Jesus takes away their reproach. And Mary is one of them. Of course, it was said of Mary that to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy pain in childbirth. Simeon said, a sword shall pierce thy side. There are a number of occasions in Mary's life when that happened, didn't it? Luke chapter 2, when his parents saw that after they left him behind, and they left him in Jerusalem, and they went away, and Mary had suddenly lost the Son of God, and to go back into Jerusalem, they finally found him in the temple, and they were astonished that he was just sitting there in the temple, and they turned to him and said, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have searched, we've been frantic, we've been panicking, looking for you. And Jesus turned to her and said, why are you looking for me? Did you not know I would be in my Father's house? Ooh, that was a bit of a sword thrust, wasn't it? That was quite a stern and painful rebuke that Mary had to endure. On another occasion in John chapter 2, at the wedding feast, when Jesus was invited to the wedding, when the wine ran out, obviously it was a wedding of somebody that was near and close to the family, maybe one of Jesus' own sisters, because Mary was very concerned, of course, with the catering affairs, and how embarrassing to run out of wine at this if you're trying to organise a wedding and you're involved in it. And it probably indicates too the fact that, you know, they weren't a wealthy family, they were poor, and she was distressed that they've suddenly run out of wine and it's going to come back upon the family and there's going to be a shame upon the family. And she says to Jesus, they've got no wine. And he turns to her and says, woman, what have I to do with you? Mine hour is not yet come. Another sword thrust, wasn't it? Mary endured many things and difficult things in terms of raising this child. The fact that she had to endure the scandal that probably would have been in around her hometown, how could she ever defend that? How could she ever defend that? Who else was going to believe that the child she had was actually born of God? So she would have lived with this scandal all her life. And now she's struggling with understanding this child. And in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 46 and verse 47 it says, Jesus was still talking with the people when his mothers and brothers arrived, and they stood outside asking to speak with him. And one of the people there said to him, look, your mother and your brother are standing outside and they want to speak with you. And Jesus answered and said, who's my mother? Who are my brothers? And he pointed to his disciples and said, look, here is my mother and brothers, those that do the will of my Father in heaven. Those are my brothers, my sisters, and my mother. See, it was really clear that Mary wanted to take Jesus away. She was concerned with his welfare. She was concerned that, you know, he's just under a lot of stress. He's put himself offside with the Jewish leaders. And so she had come that she might just take him away. He just needs a little bit of time at home. He needs a little bit of mummy care. You know, he's just too stressed. And like any mother, she's super concerned with the welfare of his son and of her son. And it's a harsh rebuke that Jesus turns around and says, well, who's my mother? Who are my brothers? You see, Mary had to learn something. There were two sides, wasn't there, to who Jesus was. Son of man and Son of God. Son of man had everything to do with his relationship with man. He was touched with the feelings of our infirmities. He walked and talked with man and represented us as a high priest taken from among men who knows how to feel for men because he's touched with the feelings of their infirmities. That was the aspect, his natural relationship with man. But then there was the relationship of the Son of God. And this was his relationship to his Father. This was the demonstration of all his power and strength and might that came from his Father. For Mary, she had this relationship with Jesus which was deeply bound up to that which was natural. In terms of his natural relationship with man, she saw Jesus as Son of Man, even though she knew that he was born through the power of the Holy Spirit. She couldn't help it. She was connected to him physically. She had borne him. The natural motherly connection. And whenever you come across Mary, you'll find that she's always concerned for the welfare of others, isn't she? She's concerned for the welfare of Jesus when she runs frantically trying to find him. She's concerned for the welfare of what's going on in the wedding when they run out of wine. She's concerned for his welfare when she comes in Matthew chapter 12 to try to take him away to a quiet place. She's always concerned for Jesus from a natural motherly instinct. And she's always concerned for others. You can see that beauty. That's the reason God chose her, because she was full of compassion and full of love. And for her, Jesus had quite strong rebukes. And she is mentioned as woman in John's Gospel on 2 occasions. The one at the wedding feast where he says, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" And now the one in John chapter 19. And here's the point, I think. There's been a lot of talk about why Jesus refers to her as woman, because he wanted to make sure that she, saw that her relationship as his mother was now passing, and that she now had to see him as a rabbi, a teacher. She now had to see him in the relationship as the Son of God, and that's true. But more than that, John's Gospel, I believe, is emphasizing over and over again that he is the seed of the woman. That's the point. And the seed of the woman was going to come and deal a crushing blow to the seed of the serpent. And that's why he refers to her twice in John's Gospel, because it's judgment upon the seed of the serpent. And so in John's record here, and here's our little connection back to the story of Genesis 3:15. In John 19, "Woman, behold thy son, son, behold thy mother." What he did was he appointed to Mary, John, to take his place to care for his mother. He appointed a son in place of himself. Now, where have you heard that done before? Genesis 4 verse 25. Adam knew his wife, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God hath appointed me another offspring instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Here was Jesus being crucified on the cross. He was suffering the bruise in the heel from the serpent, and he was being killed. And so Jesus from the cross is appointing to his mother a son in place of himself. "Woman, behold thy son, son, behold thy mother." Now, in contrast to Mary and her character, which saw Jesus from this natural side, from his connection to man, and her natural love as a mother, John, on the other hand, was a disciple who saw Jesus as his connection to God. He saw Jesus as Son of God. He saw Jesus as the one with power and might directly from God. Because that's what John's character was all about, wasn't it? Remember John, when Jesus nicknamed him? What did he say? James and John, sons of Zebedee, he surnamed the sons of thunder. These two boys, James and John, he nicknamed Boanerges or Ben Regaz. Boa is the same Greek derivative of the Hebrew word Ben. So that's where you get Boa from. And Erges is where we get the idea of energy in the Greek. Sons of energy. Sons of Regaz, it literally is. And this word that's used, Regaz, sons of Regaz, It means to quiver with violent emotion. Seen people like that before? At the AB's meetings sometimes, at your ecclesial meetings, where they're kind of just standing there and you can sitting there and you can see them holding the table a little bit tighter. You see the knuckles getting whiter and whiter, and you can start seeing the pulsing in the veins when an issue's coming, and you know it's going to happen. It's just always going to happen, because there's some people that just wind up like a dynamo, and the tension gets stronger and stronger, and all of a sudden, boof, out it comes. And John and James are like that. They, this word means to be filled with any violent emotion, by the way. They were just emotional boys. It could be to be filled with anger, could be to be filled with fear, it could be to stand in awe, to fall out, to fret, to move, to provoke, to quake, to rage, to shake, to tremble, to trouble. You can just see these guys, can't you? Look at those powerful words that's used. Like, Jesus knew him, knew both these boys. They were his cousins. I can imagine him with a twinkle in his eye when he nicknamed them Sons of Thunder. James and John. From now I will call you Sons of Thunder. And boy, how it played out in John's life, didn't it? And it says, in Mark chapter 10, they come to Jesus and they ask a question of Jesus. They said, we want to sit one on thy right hand and one on thy left hand in your glory, in your kingdom. It's just a small request. We don't want much. It's kind of neat the way they come to Jesus, isn't it? We would ask of thee one question, and whatever we ask, will you give it? My kids used to do that. Your kids do that? Mum, will you give me whatever I ask? Please, I love you. So these two boys are doing exactly that. Lord, would you give us whatever we want? And again, I can imagine Jesus smiling and say, well, that just depends. And they said, well, it's not a big request. We just want to be the, two most important people in the world next to you in your kingdom. It's not really much to ask, is it? And Jesus turns around to them, and it's really interesting, isn't it? They wanted to stand one on the left hand and one on the right hand of Jesus in his glory. And he turns around and says, well, that depends. Are you prepared to drink of the cup that I drink of? You know what that cup was, wasn't it? In the garden. Lord, if thou be willing, let this cup pass from me. Are you prepared to be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized? He was speaking of his crucifixion. And when he was lifted up, he said in John chapter 12, Lord, glorify, Father, glorify thy Son. And a voice came from heaven and said, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. And as he was lifted up in glory. They wanted to stand one on the left hand and one on the right hand of Jesus in his glory. And as John stood at the cross and he looked up at Jesus in his glory, he looked on his right hand and on his left hand, what would he have seen? That was a powerful lesson that John had to learn. Do you know, when he asked this question, of course, the other disciples were indignant because John went about doing these things and he was oblivious to the effect it would have on the other 10. It says the other disciples were angry that John and James should ask such a request, and rightly so, because they were quite determined in their character. But you can see how John was focused on Jesus in his glory, his relationship with God, with Jesus in power, so much so that he was oblivious to the other disciples. He was not caring for the other disciples. Total contrast to Mary, wasn't it? So in Luke chapter 9, it says, after there was an argument, by the way, there was an argument on the way over who was going to be the greatest, and Jesus had to take them aside and give them this little lesson on how they had to become like little children. So in Luke chapter 9, John comes to him and says, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we stopped him, we forbade him. The word in the Greek means to stop literally, physically, by force. We stopped them. Won't do that again. Here they made sure they stopped him. And Jesus said to him, well, forbid him not, for he that is not against us is for us, is with us. And John had to suffer that rebuke again from the Lord because he was so passionate in his protection for Jesus that anybody that was out there speaking about Jesus that didn't fit into his box, as far as he was concerned, was outside, and he was going to make sure they stopped. And then, of course, there is one of the more powerful incidents in Luke chapter 54, which we are very familiar with, aren't we? So Luke chapter 9, verse 54, when Jesus goes through the Samaria and the Samaritans snub Jesus, and the Samaritans noticed that Jesus wasn't going to stop there, James and John, they turned around and said, Lord, how about we bring fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even like Elijah did? And you can see how they just wanted to nuke them, to burn them. And Jesus had to rebuke John on that occasion as well. Jesus had to teach John some powerful lessons, just like he had to teach his mother some powerful lessons. And they were going to learn that at the cross. See, Mary had to see Jesus as rabbi. She had to see him as the teacher. Her relationship, her natural relationship, was now gone, and she had to become a disciple. She was outside the realm of his disciples all the way through the Gospels. It's not till we get to Acts that we find Mary inside the realm of the disciples. And it's John that's going to bring Mary close. And Jesus can see that straight away. He can see the man that will bring his mother inside the realm of discipleship is John. But John needed to learn something from Mary, didn't he? Because John was all about seeing power and might in Jesus and the glory of the kingdom, so much so that he was oblivious to the needs of his brothers and sisters. Pure religion and undefiled is to visit the fatherless and the widow in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Pure religion is seen in the example, of course, of the Good Samaritan. It's able to identify with people's sufferings. And pure religion does not allow room for personal fear, for discrimination, for environmental hardships, to restrict the administration of love. And John had to learn that. It was something which he was really challenged with. And Mary was going to help him do that. You know, you want to see a really good example of this. Mary had that natural ability that a mother has to be able to demonstrate and show true empathy. There's a really big difference between empathy and sympathy. And it's demonstrated really in the example of Mary and John. John was probably a man that was very good at showing sympathy, like most men are, sadly. Sympathy is feeling for somebody, is the simple idea. Empathy is feeling with somebody. Jesus, it says, was touched with the feelings of our infirmities. He was a high priest that was able to connect to people. He was able to feel with them. He was tried in all points like as we are, yet without sin. Now I'll show you a little example where John really had to learn this lesson in the next chapter in John, because he still hasn't got it. But Peter and John, of course, both had to learn this lesson. John chapter 20. See, Peter and John had this argument continuously over who was going to be the greatest. That's who the argument was always about, by the way, between Peter and John. The disciples never had any doubt of who the top three disciples were, because Jesus took Peter, James and John with him on several occasions up to the Mount of Transfiguration. So all the other disciples never disagreed that Peter, James and John in Jesus' position were, you know, the most important, top ranking, because Jesus treated them with such privilege. So when it says there was an argument amongst the disciples who was going to be the greatest, where was that argument? Clearly between Peter and John. So when you get to John chapter 20 and you've got this little race going on, this is beautiful of John, isn't it? And why does he tell us about this little race? He's giving us a little insight into the competitive spirit. You know, fire and rage. That's John, son of thunder. You'll never beat him in a race, no matter how fast your legs are, if he's passionate about getting there for whatever reason, because he has enormous amounts of energy. And in verse 2 it says, when Mary came to the sepulchre, she ran in and saw the sepulchre was empty, and she came running to tell Peter and John. And it says, they went forth, verse 3, and the other disciple came to the sepulchre. They ran both together. The other disciple did outrun Jesus, and outran Peter, and came first to the sepulchre. So they went in, and they looked into the sepulchre, and then they went away from there. Now there's something really interesting going on in the background here, and it's the story of Mary Magdalene. You know, when you look at Mary Magdalene, I just want to give you the one example when you look at the verse we just looked at in John chapter 19. John chapter 19, verse 25. There stood by the foot of the cross Jesus, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. You know what's unique about that verse? Is Mary Magdalene is not connected to anybody. See how it says that? Mary, the mother of Jesus, his mother's sister. It's all about personal family relationships. Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary, mother, daughter, sister. No, Mary Magdalene. All she was ever known as was Mary of Magdala. You know why? She had nobody. Now, it's a study all on itself, but I believe Mary Magdalene had nobody. She had no family background. She's always known as Mary Magdalene. And so when she was healed of her 7 demons and she dedicated her life to the Lord, he was everything to her because she had nobody else. So here's this interesting thing. After the death of Jesus, she's just lost the only person she has that she could truly call family. And so now she tries to make connection with Peter and John. She runs to Peter and John to tell them that she's been to the sepulchre and the tomb's empty. Peter and John come back, and Mary is totally beside herself. In verse 11 and verse 13 and in verse 15, you'll see Mary weeping. 3 times the record says she's weeping. So much so that she's oblivious to everything that's going on around her. She is completely broken. She is so distraught, she's probably slipping back into her mental relapse, back to her state of having 7 devils. Peter and John come running to the sepulchre. Mary finally makes her way down there because Peter and John ran very fast. She finally makes her way down there as well. She comes to the sepulchre. They go in there a look, and it says in verse 8, then went in the other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, saw and believed, for as yet they knew not the scripture that he must again rise from the dead. Then the disciples went again unto their own home. But that's such a powerful word here. But Mary stood without weeping. See what's happened? They went to their own home, but Mary stood without. They left her there. They left her there. This woman who is so distraught, and she's completely broken, and these 2 disciples come down, they go on and look in the sepulchre, and they turn back, and the record says, and they went to their own home. You know why they went? It's because men struggle with how to show empathy. There's a real difference between sympathy and empathy, as we said. Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy, more often than not, drives disconnection. Empathy is about perspective taking. Empathy is about putting on somebody's shoes. It's about really being in touch with their feelings. And empathy is a vulnerable process, because in order for me to really show empathy to you, I have to connect to that feeling inside you which I know. And it's not comfortable to connect with that feeling. So being able to demonstrate and show empathy is being able to truly connect. And you know, in truly showing empathy, it means staying out of judgment, which is really difficult to do when we enjoy it so much. And to truly share and show empathy with somebody, we need to completely stay out of judgment to be able to make that connection. Sympathy, on the other hand, is a response more often than not that tries to fix the problem, tries to provide a solution to the problem. And that's why women are far better at empathy than men are, and they have a far ability. I'm losing my sound. But women it's far easier for women to show an empathetic response, because I think it's built in, because they have that connection that they have physically that God's put in there through childbirth. So that's why Mary was such an incredible, powerful example of empathy, to be touched with the feelings of other people's feelings. Whereas men, on the other hand, they don't make that connection very often, and they're always trying to fix things, because that's what man does. And so when man sees somebody that's broken or in a difficult situation, he wants to provide a solution to it. You know, an empathetic response hardly, if ever, will start with the words "at least." Whereas a sympathetic response often, more often than not, will start with the words "at least." You know, I lost my job today. Oh, at least you've got your health. Oh, you know, I've really got these bad back pains. I can hardly walk. At least you've got a good job. Should be thankful. I think Johnny doesn't want to come to the meeting anymore. Wow, you know, at least Sarah's really dedicated. She's keen. And see, a sympathetic response always wants to somehow try to put the silver lining around it, try to make it feel better. But sometimes when a person's broken and in a deep, dark place and they're feeling pain, there is no response to make it better. There's nothing you can actually say that's going to make it better, but what you can do is you can be there. And when Peter and John went away and left Mary at the tomb weeping, it was because they didn't know how to deal with her. She was so broken they didn't know how to fix her. But what they could have done was made sure one of them all stayed with her in that state. No wonder Jesus turned round to Peter in the very next chapter in John chapter 21 and said, "Peter, lovest thou me more than these?" And Peter said, "Yea, Lord, thou knowest." He said, "Well, then feed my lambs." You know, Mary was one of his lambs. She was the least of these, his brethren. And they had just left her there. And so 3 times Jesus had to say, well, if you love me, then you show it by feeding my lambs. And Jesus' third saying from the cross is such a powerful statement of love. It encapsulates these two people, but encapsulates Jesus' love for his mother and Jesus' love for this disciple whom he loved. And he gave to them this incredible commission, especially to John, that he'd go and care for this lady in her old age. You know, this disciple, this son of thunder, this guy that wanted to bring fire down from heaven, he's the same one that writes the epistles of love, isn't he? He's the one that uses phrases like, "my little children," over and over again. When you read the epistles of John, they're so tender, aren't they? You can't imagine them being written by Boanerges. You can't imagine being written by a man who wants to bring fire down from heaven. Somehow this man has become incredibly empathetic. And there's all these family terms that he uses, fathers and mothers and my little children, and the theme of love that comes out of it. How did he learn that? Where did he get that from? How did he change so much? He went and spent time with the Lord's mother, the handmaid of the Lord, who knew what it was like to feel with other people. May it be, brothers and sisters, we can take that third saying into our own life and see how we might be able to share and communicate one with another and see the two sides of the character of the Son of God and Son of Man.